Leading this impeachment inquiry, Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland, a member of both the Judiciary and Oversight Committees. Congressman, maybe you can explain to us what this vote is and what these procedures mean.
Well, we're voting on procedures that formalize the impeachment investigation. It gives the chairman of the committee the power to denote a particular hearing as part of the impeachment inquiry, and it also gives him the power to say that a particular subcommittee hearing is part of the general impeachment inquiry. And other than that, the big part that I took away from it is that after all of the members conduct their traditional 5-minute questioning, both the Democrats and the Republicans would have a half hour more of questioning by staff available. So it formalizes what we're doing as we enter into a new season here.
Okay, so that means there's going to be a full House vote on that? Is this right?
No, this is just in the Judiciary Committee.
Just in the committee. So the committee is going to vote on this. It's going to formalize these procedures. Is it your understanding at the conclusion of that vote, there will formally, in a constitutional sense, be an impeachment inquiry underway?
Well, look, the Constitution doesn't define when an impeachment inquiry is underway.
No, I know that, but I'm asking you.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we're in it now, but I think it's great that the committee will formalize it with this procedure. But look, we're being hit on a daily basis, inundated with new high crimes and misdemeanors. The stuff that we found out about the vice president's trip to Ireland, about the redirection of the Air Force crews to go to the Trump Hotel in Scotland, that's just amazing stuff. The president has converted the government of the United States into an instrument of self-enrichment, and this is the original sin of the Trump administration, and it was the main thing that the framers were trying to prevent. They did not want the government being used as a for-profit enterprise by the president.
What is the timeline here? I want to play for you a little bit of your colleague, Jerry Nadler, who's the chair of this committee, talking about his understanding of the Trump administration's view of the timeline on this, and then get your response to it. Take a listen.
Well, the president clearly is trying to run out the clock. The president has said he would oppose all subpoenas. That was Article 3 of the Nixon impeachment, that the president opposed subpoenas. Nixon wasn't foolish enough to say in advance he was going to oppose all subpoenas. That in itself, I think, is a high crime and misdemeanor under the Constitution, that you're obstructing the work of Congress in investigating.
How do you get around that, and what is the timeline here?
Well, in an ordinary presidential administration, 16 months left to go would be something like very near the end of the fourth quarter. But in Trump time, that's an eternity. Can you imagine the damage that he can inflict on the country in the next 16 months? And I think that more and more of our colleagues have come around to the view that we need to be on a constitutional high alert. We need every tool in the constitutional toolkit on the table. And so we're going to, the problem with Trump, of course, is that there are too many impeachable offenses. With Bill Clinton, they basically had one thing on the guy. He lied about sex. With Donald Trump, we're just overwhelmed with the domestic emoluments clause, the foreign government emoluments clause, the federal election campaign finance violations, and so on.
So Byron New York, who's a conservative reporter and pundit, was trying to make the case that because there's a scope now that's wide, it includes the look into the president's involvement in the illegal conspiracy to hide those hush money payments, as well as other things, that this is a tacit acknowledgement that the Mueller report itself is not sufficient for the beginning of an impeachment inquiry. What's your response to that?
I mean, I think that's totally wrong. I mean, there were dozens of criminal indictments that came out of the Mueller investigation. There were 7 guilty pleas and criminal convictions, and we learned of 9 or 10 different episodes of presidential obstruction. It's just that that's a very narrow snapshot of all of the lawlessness taking place in the Trump administration, and it happens to be one that is not the most intuitive to the public. I think that the public understands that the president is essentially a businessman, albeit a failed and corrupt businessman, but that's what he is. And he has turned the government into a for-profit enterprise, and he's looting the assets of the people. Every time that they go down to Mar-a-Lago, it's costing the federal taxpayers $75,000 or $100,000 for the FBI and the Secret Service and the Department of Defense and so on, going right into the coffers of the Trump industry. And that is precisely what the founders warned us against. And that's why they said in that case, Congress can't even approve of it. In the case of foreign government payments, theoretically we could approve of it, but I hope within the next few weeks we will formally disapprove of every foreign government payment he's pocketed.
That's very interesting. Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.